They can look at me.
Yeah, we're gonna do it now.
So you're going to give it should I hold that side to make sure? I'll hold that side. Okay.
So I'm gonna like move over and there we go. Good morning, everyone here and everyone joining us on Ustream today. Welcome to the IDEA Forum with ALA President-elect MollyRaphael. We're very pleased to have here today. I'm Nora Bird, and I'm going to be sort of a moderator, but I'm going to also introduce Molly this morning. And I hope you all read her very extensive bio that we sent out as an invitation to this meeting. And I know one of my enterprising students also read your blog. It's always good to know about who's speaking when you come to a forum like this. And Molly said three important things that she wanted to focus on, and I'm sure she's going to talk about those three things today. And those were advocacy, diversity, and defending our core values of intellectual freedom, equity of access, and privacy. And I'm sure that all of you have heard those themes running throughout all of our classes in the program. But those were the official things, the official biography and the official candidacy literature. So I wanted to see what I could find out that was like a little hidden if I just Googled her. So, so a couple of the things that I found out is that she graduated from Simmons College, my alma mater. So, yay! And her first job was assistant librarian at Wilbraham, Massachusetts Public Library. If you've never been to Wilbraham, I have only been through it. It's a pretty small town in what's called Western Massachusetts, which is more central Massachusetts. And it is very close to Amherst and other big famous colleges, but it's a pretty small town. So she didn't stay there very long, but it proves that you can start out really small and grow a very large and very important library career. So you don't have to start at the top. You can start small. So, and then one of her jobs along the way, it was called Chief Telephone Information and Reference at the District of Columbia Public Library. This was in 1976. In 1976, that was probably much like the emerging technology librarian job would be now. She was on the cutting edge. The last thing that I learned about Molly, and I was very glad to see this because I struggle with this myself, she doesn't keep up her blog any better than I do. So we're very glad to have Molly with us today, and I'm going to turn it over to her.
Thank you very much, Nora. Just a couple of notes on that introduction. First of all, I highly recommend, if it just happens to people, that you start a job in a small library, because what that did for me was I absolutely did and saw everything a library did. I cataloged all the adult books. I did story time for children. I was the reference librarian every third Saturday and on one evening a week. I worked at the circulation desk when it was a Saturday of the week because of the way the staffing was. And I saw the interrelationships of sort of all these different functions of the library. I didn't realize it at the time how useful it would be in my life, but it really was. I really became aware of what were the things that someone working in cataloging or technical services, what perspective did that person have versus what did the reference person have. So when I got in a larger library system, I really kind of understood the differences in those institutional cultures still within the same institution. And then I had a chance later to either work in or manage those departments, sometimes a second level supervisor, so I wasn't working with them directly, but it served me very well. So that was that little library experience, which was because my husband was teaching at a prep school there, and then he went back to graduate school, which was the reason we were there such a short time and put me in Washington, D.C. So let me just say a couple of little things about my background, a couple of things about the introduction and the priority areas I have, which are still the same as I'm trying to carry out my campaign promises, as any good politician would do. My life has been spent in public libraries, most of it in the District of Columbia Public Library, but the last 7 years in the Multnomah County Library in Portland, Oregon. Two very different library systems. People say, oh, you're bi-coastal. Like that's a big thing to have worked on both coasts of the country. And it's, I will tell you, when you move in your mid-50s to the West Coast, having spent all of your time living in the Northeast, even if you've traveled to the West, it's a culture shock to get out there. It's wonderful in many ways, but you have to learn to adjust the way you live your life in order to sort of feel comfortable and fit in more ways than you would think being part of this United States. Anyway, two very different library systems. One that had been funded well on and off, but was really struggling when I left it in DC, and then went to an extremely well-supported and well-funded library system in Multnomah County in Oregon. One of what I think is premier library systems in the country, does fantastic work in children and youth services. While I was there, I had an opportunity to really introduce services to serving the more diverse populations there. The Portland area has kind of a reputation as being much more homogeneous than it really is, and it had some populations, ethnic and cultural populations that had been there for a number of years that we had been serving but not serving very well, and so we were able to develop some real services in those areas while I was there. But it was also a library system that was extremely well used. The difference between being in Washington, D.C., where the federal government dominates, but there is a local government that delivers all the services that local governments usually do, and then being in Portland, Oregon, in Multnomah County Library, is that if in Washington, D.C., when I would meet people, they would ask me what I did probably within the first 30 seconds of when I met them, because that's what the culture is there. It's all about what you do. And if I told them I was a director of the District of Columbia Public Library, I'd probably get a response which would be like, oh, that's a really important institution, this sort of philosophical, how important libraries are in society kind of response. In Multnomah County, people would talk to me for half an hour before they'd get around to asking me what I did. And it was usually when I'd say something like, well, I just moved here a year ago. And they'd say, oh, what brought you here? And I'd say a job. And they'd say, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm the new director of the Multnomah County Library. And without fail, I would get oh, I love the library. First of all, they had personal, you could tell from that they had personal experience with it. And then they would launch into some story about, I take my grandson there every other Saturday, and he gets books and videos and other things. But they had this really personal connection. And it was a wonderful thing for someone like me who had spent so long working in public libraries and really believing in the role of public libraries in the community, to be able to be in a community where people really appreciated the library. And many, many people I'd have that conversation with. So quite a contrast in the level of funding, quite a contrast in terms of the use level. I mean, our buildings were small and our buildings were jam-packed with people all the time, any time of day. And it was a lovely way to spend the last few years of my working life. I retired in 2009, May of 2009, and thought I was going to go off into lovely retirement when I got asked to run for president of the American Library Association. And after long discussions with my husband about it, we finally decided I'd go ahead and try, and then if I won, I'd have a commitment for 3 years, and if I didn't, we'd go back to the plan we had. So you can see I'm sitting in this seat, which means that I did win. And although you could certainly have Sarah Kelly-Johns here, and she would talk to you about school libraries, so it doesn't mean because you won that the other person wouldn't have been a good president. Obviously, she would have been. So I'm having a great time now. Really, what I consider to be, in some ways, almost a logical step from my involvement in the American Library Association. I started working in ALA in the mid-'70s when I was a fairly young librarian and fairly new librarian. And I did because the dean of my library school, Tom Galvin, I don't know if any of you knew Tom Galvin, but Tom Galvin at Simmons. Were you there when Tom Galvin was at Simmons? Well, Tom Galvin was a big ALA promoter, and in his classes he would routinely talk to us about joining ALA and becoming active in ALA, and he would say in state associations too, but it's very clear to me that he thought ALA was where the action was. So I had an opportunity to go to a conference in 1974 that was in New York City, and I just got absolutely on fire with excitement and learning that happened at that conference, and have been involved ever since. Around the same time, I started taking sign language classes from two women. There were two women who were deaf who worked in our cataloging department, and they decided to teach sign language to anyone on the staff who wanted to learn it. And so I started taking the sign language class and signing with these two women and the other people in the class. And then we started sort of thinking about what were libraries doing to serve people who were deaf. And there's a fairly organized community in Washington because of Gallaudet College being there. There's a K through 12 school as well. National Association for the Deaf is in DC. So there's a lot of things that are going on. It was right at the same time I was getting active in ALA, so I decided to see what ALA was doing on serving people who were deaf, and ALA was doing nothing. I mean, literally nothing. There was a big program on serving the blind and physically handicapped, but it was not, it was really the Braille and eventually books on tape and all that kind of thing, but not doing anything particularly in the area of serving people who were deaf. So I started just trying to see what ALA was doing in that area, and since we weren't doing anything, I tried to organize a meeting. Now, this is the kind of thing that a enthusiastic but naive 20-something does in the American Library Association. So tweet about this one, is that I don't know what gave me the courage. I don't think it was courage, but it seems like it when I look back at it. But I called this meeting. I had no idea how many people would show up. I thought I'd just have it like in my hotel room or something like that. And someone in my library helped me get a meeting room at the conference. I went to the appointed place at the appointed time, and about 50 people showed up. And it was people from all over the country, many sort of high-level people in large public library systems that were starting to do some work in this area. And from that, I got talked into, at that conference, actually going to the ALA Executive Board with a petition that we form a committee or something to investigate this, that ALA really needed to do this. And I was treated extremely well. People were very enthusiastic, and now that I realize that I'm in the position to actually do that in return, I kind of understand it, because I'm so eager to have the people who are new to our profession really involved in our professional association that I can see why they just didn't say, you know, what do you think you're doing here? I mean, like, you have to pay your dues in this organization for 20 years before you can come before the executive board and ask for anything. So and they appointed Clara Jones, who was the president of ALA, first African-American president of ALA. Clara appointed a committee, appointed me to chair that committee. We spent some time, and I had fantastic people in the committee who really knew the structure of ALA and all the kinds of things that I didn't know that I needed to know. Very smart appointments to the committee. And we worked it through the process, and it got set up within the organization, and it's been moved, it's sort of changed some over the last 30 plus years, but it continues to this day and really works with libraries that are interested in how they can better serve people in the community who are deaf or hearing impaired. So that was kind of my entree into ALA, and it was really kind of one that I didn't plan, but being asked to run for president was in some ways a very logical thing for me. If you look at my ALA experience, you'll see I was in a lot of different places and had different kinds of responsibilities and served on the governance body. I will tell you I'm doing this because I'm personally interested, but I'm also very interested in encouraging new people in the profession to be professionally active. I think you can do that now without going to conferences twice a year, but I would encourage you to figure out ways to get to conferences as much as you can, because there's so much opportunity for networking and expanding your horizons about everything that you're doing. Excuse me. When I applied for the job at Multnomah County, one of the things that I knew was probably an obstacle for me was that I had spent my entire career in one library system. And a lot of people will see that as something that gives you kind of tunnel vision because you've only seen things from that one place. I'd had all kinds of jobs in that library system, so I really knew and understood libraries, public libraries, but I hadn't had different perspectives by working in different communities. It was really ALA that allowed me to talk about that. It was really knowing and working with people in libraries all across the country over the past 25 years that I was able to talk about, and how I was able to make sure that I had broad perspective in what I was doing and seeing. And anyway, so I certainly want to encourage you to the new folks who are here to be involved. And I know that library educators have their own organization, but I also know many of them that have been active in ALA as well, and it's a very important part of our professional association that we have such a cross-section of people working within the profession. So let me just say a little bit about the initiatives that I'm working on in the, as president. If you're coming to the thing this afternoon, later this afternoon in Chapel Hill, you'll hear some repetition. But when you run for president, you sort of figure out what are the things that you think are most important that you would pay attention to. As ALA president, you pay attention to everything. And as ALA president, sometimes issues take you rather than you take issues. So there are many things that I will do as ALA president that are not things that I may have determined are areas that I wanted to focus on, but they are important to the profession. So the first thing that you know is that you are representing and speaking for the entire profession. You're not speaking for whatever background you came from. And as a public library director, I often spoke to the media, to politicians, other community and business leaders, but I was speaking as the public library director. So there's a shift in terms of how I represent this profession, how I represent our organization when I'm speaking in public, when I'm speaking to the media, variety of different kinds of things that I'll be doing. But the area that I've been focused on the most in the past really 8 months is advocacy. And it's one of ALA's priority areas, but it seems particularly important now because of the economic situation that we're in. It doesn't matter what type of library you're in, frankly. Everybody's feeling the pinch in some ways. We're reading sad stories of libraries closing because they totally lose their funding in the public library world. We're reading of schools where they're deciding that they'll keep a library, but they don't really need a school librarian in that library. They can just have that sort of open the door and maybe have somebody sits in there and kind of keeps people from getting into trouble. But other than that, what else would we? In academic libraries, I know that there's a lot of competition on campus for, whether you're Harvard with a huge endowment where the endowment isn't producing at the level it was, or a school that doesn't have a huge endowment but is also dependent on the revenue that comes in through tuitions and other resources. Every place is really struggling with funding. So part of what I hope will come out of the work we're doing on advocacy is that it won't be something where we only do it when we're in big financial trouble. I think where we're at a real disadvantage when we're sitting at the table where the pie is being divided up is that we seem to be an easy target. We get a huge proposed cut. The community gets all riled up about it and makes politicians' lives miserable. Please, can you get those library supporters to stop calling my office? I've heard enough. That kind of, and they sort of begrudgingly give back some money because they know they need to for their political future. If we can start talking about libraries in ways that happen year in and year out, not just when we're really struggling for resources, I think we'll be in a much better starting position. I know the public library world the best, obviously, but in the public library world, it's the public services are broken into the essential services and then the kind of discretionary services. So police and fire are essential. We've got to have police and fire. And a lot of places will say, so we won't cut their budget at all now. I can tell you that every police and fire department has some discretionary money that, in order to put out the fires and keep the community safe. There are some places that they could also make reductions, but sometimes they're just considered essential, so we can't possibly cut them. And then there are all these other services that are over there. What I'm working really hard to do with this initiative with a team of people, and eventually it'll go out broadly into the association, is to try to find a way to move libraries into that essential category. There are some elected officials that I know of who actually talk about libraries in that way, but not a lot. So my campaign theme when I was running was libraries essential for learning, essential for life. And what I was really trying to do was make that leap from libraries are nice to have to libraries are essential. I think we can do that. I think we can do that around all the kinds of issues related to technology and learning and just, you all know, but I think what we haven't been doing is talking about those very well. We talked for many years. Some of you in this room will probably remember this conversation, although the students, I'm sure you won't. But we talked for many years about inputs into libraries. How many books did you have per capita? Then we talked about outputs. How many books did you circulate per capita? So it was all about how much were you doing. Now we're finally, and have been for a while, talking about outcomes. What's the actual impact of what the library does? So what we're doing with this initiative is really looking at how do we help people move to talking about outcomes? How do we do it in ways that people are talking about outcomes that people care about, decision makers care about? So if it's a school library, how do we talk about it in terms of the impact on reducing the dropout rate or things like that. So if it's a public library, how do we talk about the importance of what public libraries are doing for workforce development in ways that suddenly it becomes much more central rather than this nice little place over here that everybody loves. So as much as I think that I Love My Library campaign is wonderful, I don't want people talking about I love my library. I want them to talk about why the library makes a difference in their community, why it transforms their lives, why it's transformative within their community. And I'm talking about all types of libraries now. So I'm really talking about how do you look at the value of academic libraries and the contributions that academic libraries make toward student retention or persistence to graduation, or toward attracting research funding to a university. How do we take, and there's a lot of good research that's been going on in this area. It's one of the areas that I really hope we can do some bridging of the conversation that needs to take place between the faculty in library schools that are doing the research around some of these issues and the people who are working in the libraries and talking to the elected officials. I think we also do it by getting powerful people to talk to them. And when I say powerful people, I'm not saying us. As long as librarians are talking about the importance of libraries, what we sound like we're doing is talking about preserving our jobs. There's always that sense that there's some self-interest when you talk about, oh, you can't cut the library because, and people are sitting there thinking because you don't want to lose your job, rather than because of what the contribution is. We've seen the effect, I've seen it many times in the public library world, where the father of a third grader comes in and says, before an assembled group of elected officials, my son was falling behind in reading badly, and he enrolled in the summer reading program of the public library this past summer, and now he's so excited about reading, and he's doing much better in school. And suddenly these elected officials that I've been trying to talk about the importance of our summer reading program to, they suddenly have this aha light bulb that goes off in their heads. And they realize that there's great value in what the library is doing in terms of contributing to the education of the young people in the community. So what our initiative will really look at is how do we help those people come forward, and how do we arm them with the information that is really persuasive to decision makers about why libraries are important. There's another important component of this, and I think this is something that goes naturally with when we look at outcomes, and that is really looking at what libraries are doing to support the communities they're serving, the larger purposes of the communities they're serving. So my very long, short title, long subtitle to the advocacy initiative is Empowering Voices. Libraries speak out for, communities speak out for libraries, and libraries speak out for communities. And the important part is that second part, which is recognizing that the way we talk about libraries in terms of fulfilling the mission of a university, rather than what we have and why you would want to come to us, that's going to be critically important, but that means we really start listening much more to our communities. Some libraries in academia, some libraries that are public, some libraries that are school, some that are special, are all doing this fairly well right now, but lots aren't. Lots are still struggling with how do we talk about our libraries. So what we're hoping to do is help them figure out what that process is, provide some tools, provide some face-to-face training as well as some virtual training, have in the end a much more comprehensive advocacy website at ALA where there'll be lots of tools for the kind of things that people would need. So that's sort of what's going to unfold over the next year or 15 months or so from this initiative. And it really builds on what the initiatives are of my predecessors. Second area that we're working on is diversity. Again, this is something that I've been really interested in and involved in, frankly, going back to when I started working on services to the deaf community. I worked in Washington, D.C., which has a very diverse population, and worked in communities that were all across the spectrum in many very low income, high risk communities in terms of children's education and many things like that. So it's been a really important area to me. I had the opportunity, as I mentioned earlier, to do this also in Multnomah County in a very different environment, but also equally important that we pay attention to the populations and the groups that are in our community and that we needed to serve. So what I'm really looking at is sort of, you know, there's a lot of work that goes on in the area of diversity that talks a lot about issues, but doesn't seem to deliver anything in the end. So I've been working with a group of people that I've just pulled together from diverse backgrounds to talk about what we might do. And we're really looking at how do we do things within ALA to provide opportunities to what I've been describing as connect all the work we do on leadership development within the association and all the work we do around diversity. So how do we take it so when we have Spectrum scholars, they go through library school and they get their degree and then they become professionally active, and how do we make certain that we provide some clear pathways for leadership development within the association? There are tremendous opportunities for leadership development within ALA that then you can carry back to your workplace, but we're not real good at making those pathways very obvious. So we're in for some fairly early stages about how to look at doing this. We'll probably start rolling some things out in the fall. We'll certainly have some programs at midwinter and annual next year, so not this annual that's coming up in New Orleans, but in Dallas and then in Anaheim. So stay tuned for that. That's definitely an area where I'm working with, again, with a good group of people. And the last thing of defending the core values, the third area I will tell you is something that every ALA president needs to do. The core values of the association are so central to my being, and the reason that I not only, it's not that I'm an accidental librarian, you know, I kind of stumbled into being a librarian, but I love that I found a profession that connects so much with the values that I think are really important in life and in our country and in our society. So I will be an enthusiastic defender of those. I'd love to live in a time where we didn't have to defend those core values, but I think we do, and I think we will continue to. We never quite know what's going to pop up and be the issue of the day. There a good friend and colleague of mine, Ann Simons, who is a school librarian from Juneau, Alaska, and was president of ALA about 12 or 13 years ago. Ann spent her whole life as ALA president defending the filtering, not filtering issue. It took over her presidency. And she did a great job with it, but it was not something that she sort of thought she'd be spending her ALA president. It was. So as I said, it's something that the issues identify themselves and come forward, and that's fine because I will defend them with enthusiasm. So what I really would like to do with the rest of the time we have available is ask you to share your thoughts and ideas with me. What do you think is important in not just the future of ALA, but future of libraries in general? What are the issues that you struggle with the most? What did I talk about that resonated with you? But what did I not talk about that you wished I'd talk about? Those kinds of things. And I'm going to take notes. This is, as I said, as much a listening opportunity for me as it is a talking. I spilled a lot out right now, and now would like to be a little quiet and turn it over to you. You're welcome to ask me questions about anything that you want to, not the Middle East and solving problems there, but you know, anything in the library world that's on your mind. But also, I'd just love to hear your thoughts and ideas. So I don't know who wants to start.
I can say something.
Okay.
We had a student-run student conference here on Saturday, and Stanley Wilder of Atkins Library at UNC Charlotte came up and spoke. And this is kind of on the resonance end of things. He was talking about, this relates to what you were saying about how people don't really want to hear statistics. They want to hear that anecdote that gets right at the heart of why libraries are relevant and important. You know, it's not very compelling to hear, you know, this many students had this kind of result about blah, blah, blah. But also he was talking about how, at least this is my interpretation, about how we're kind of at the end of the point where libraries tell people what they're for. I think their slogan for their student services was something about your work better and faster. Mm-hmm. And I just think it's really interesting that we're coming to this point where we don't tell people, you know, you come here and we will provide this to you.
Right.
It's let us know what it is that you are using us for and how that can be better. And
That's great.
I don't really have a question or a...
Well, thank you for sharing that, because that's exactly the kind of thing that makes sense. I mean, first of all, one of the things that anyone who has really tried to defend a budget, particularly before a group of elected officials in a city or a county, is that anecdotes, stories have great power. They have even more power when they have statistics sort of coupled with them. So, you know, if we could say we had 75,000 children in the summer reading program this summer, and that was 80% of the kids that were in public school, K through, 12 or whatever. And then a story, a real story, and sometimes it's a story that I would tell, and sometimes it would be a story that somebody else who actually experienced it would tell. But the other piece, that piece about telling, if you look really back at library history, and even, you don't even have to go back before my career. I remember when I was a children's librarian. I started as a children's librarian at DC Public Library, and the kids were all coming in, and they wanted Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Nancy Drew mysteries. And we didn't have them because we had only good literature, and those weren't considered good literature. So these kids would come in all excited about reading, and we'd say, oh no, we don't have those, we have only good literature. Well, eventually we ended up having a sort of a non-cataloged donated collection of Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys and stuff. And finally, I think we realized as a profession that anything that gets kids reading is really, really good. So, and I saw it happen, kids who would be reading Nancy Drew's, that I could steer them toward other mysteries in the children's collection that were good literature, and they'd be much happier. But we used to tell people what was good. Then we told them what we had, and now we were adapting more to what they were asking for. But it's going one step beyond, which is really going out and finding, getting in, sort of embedding yourself in the community so you can identify what those needs are and then figure out how to deliver them to people. That, I think, is really the big step that we have to take, where we're pushing out, but we're pushing out so that we actually identifying needs that are there, and we're pushing those services out. So thank you for sharing that.
You have an online comment. Artifact from Anthony Chow. He suggested that if you could have the pattern talking about the significant impact of libraries in terms of advocacy.
Yes. Then
maybe we could create these library videos and send out to local libraries so they could recreate those videos using their own stenciler.
The idea of using videos is one that's very much something that ALA has recognized it's a real opportunity to do. So there's actually the current president of ALA, Roberta Stevens. Her main initiative is called Our Authors, Our Advocates. And ALA is now doing a bunch of recordings of authors, well-known authors, who are talking about the importance of libraries. And I just had someone who emailed me, and it'll take me a minute to remember where it came from, who said that she just heard Cokie Roberts speak someplace, and Cokie Roberts has just published a new book, and she was speaking to a group of librarians. And she didn't talk about the book, she talked about how important libraries were, and that she really wanted to help us tell that story. So you can bet I fired something right off to Roberta and said, if you haven't gotten Cokie Roberts, get her. But there are a variety of ways I think that ALA is looking at how to actually do things that are in the public domain for libraries to use, with ways that you can then put taglines on them. There was a really famous, can you believe it, famous ALA video in the early 70s, mid-70s, during Watergate. And it was, I see a nodding head, or you remember this one. It was intended to look like a Senate hearing room. and it had a very southern drawl by the voice that was, and it was, the camera was on the, was supposed to look like the chair of the Senate committee. So, and the senator was saying, so you're saying, sir, that the organization you work for provides its services free to the public? And this kind of penetrating questions that were very much like the Watergate hearings were. And at the very end, the senator said, the actor senator said, what's the name of your organization? And the voice said, it's the public library. And then there was a place that you could put a tagline for the public library of wherever you were. And people use that, and the incredible thing is with PSAs, you know, PSAs usually run at 2:30 in the morning. These PSAs would run in the middle of, you know, really popular TV shows. So there's a real opportunity, I think, for us to do a video kind of thing that we put out there to make it adaptable for people in different types of libraries to use.
Yeah, I was reminded when I was teaching up at Ithaca College, one of the problems they had was that they had vocational service, and the bus of the vocational students was the same bus they used for the mentally disabled students. And it was a yellow bus, and it was called BOCES, and the kids used to refer to the kids going to vocational training as BOTARDs, and it was really a terrible sort of thing. So what we did was created an ad campaign where we had, to really boost the image of those kids in vocational training. And so the spots would typically look like the bus is broken down and everybody's hot and sweaty. The driver's underneath the hood, and finally, there's a teenage girl that gets on the bus, and she's got crying all over it. The bus driver gets in his thing, starts the engine up. He turns to the girl and says, "Where did you learn how to do that?" She says, "School." And then the tagline. And so in the same way, I'm thinking about, what about an interview of a policeman or a fireman, one of these essential services people? Where did you learn how to put out this fire? The library. You know, if there's some way to show how the libraries are value added for what are perceived to be essential services. You know.
That's one of the things that we're talking about, is the people we want talking to the decision makers are leading businessmen in the community, policemen, firemen, exactly the people, that's exactly what we're looking at. How do we do that? And in fact, one of the people who's involved in this, who works at ALA, has said, she said, my doctor is the perfect person. You know, he's somebody who would come across really well. Again, doctors talking about the importance of being able to find out information, and then the way libraries know that you don't let your resources turn in the way that people do self-diagnosis, but they can actually get information about something, and then they know they need to go to the doctor, or they have a relative who's been diagnosed with some disease and they want to find out all they can about that disease to understand it, all those kinds of things. So absolutely right. In Los Angeles, one of the bright spots, I was talking to somebody earlier about, this is a time of severe disappointment and bright spots in our profession. And Los Angeles just passed a voter-approved measure. Los Angeles gets a certain percent, Los Angeles Public Library, the city library system, gets a certain percentage of its budget designated by law from the city's budget. And they were losing money and having big budget cuts, and they've just rebuilt all their libraries and built new libraries in communities, and really revitalized the system. And that money was being cut. Their money was being cut enough that they decided to go to the voters for a increase in what that minimum amount would be. Now, this is at a time when people are worried about taxes anyway, obviously. It's at a time when the city is clearly, like every other city in jurisdiction, dealing with major revenue shortfalls for funding, just continuing to fund services. but the police chief of Los Angeles supported passage of this measure on the ballot. The police union did not, because they worried that there would be police jobs that would be cut as a result. But the police chief was on record as saying the library is a really important place particularly for teens. After school, it's a good place for them to go. It's stimulating environment. They're not out on the street making trouble, all kinds of things like that. So that's exactly the kinds of things that have the power beyond one person, because suddenly you might start thinking about, oh, the library actually contributes something that's important to the law enforcement part of the community. So that's a nice story that would be police and fire too.
Maybe I'm Shannon John from probably only person from the library. Just a little story. I met Molly when Marine recruited me to have campaign. So I remember, because that time I remember that morning when I met her, tried to see what you're going to do when you become president. She started talking about her points, and I'm glad that you mentioned that after you get the election and you try to deliver those points. And sometimes we also complain about politicians because they promised during the campaign when they and actually when they become in office, because the situation is different. I'm glad you mentioned that we do talk about accuracy. Also mentioned university academic libraries. We are in a critical point. In the past, we often try to prove ourselves valuable intellectual heart of the university by numbers. How many people come to the library, like food exit, in and out, how many books we collected, how many electronic journals, how many people check out, blah, blah, blah. I think that's the number, maybe statistics, but on the other hand, you mentioned really, I think this is important for us to show, because those numbers should be translated into how we have the university attract research dollars. Any professor trying to get research funding have to look at the literature first to use that research resources. Also, a very important for UCG for the retention and the recruitment retention. How our efforts help that. Maybe one story we should tell, because the university running the visitor tours. Maybe some students just decide to come to UCG because they love the library. They see libraries are nice than their college, high school library or community college library. So those are very good points. We really thank you for that to cover academic part, even if you come from public library background. And another point I just appreciate the diversity on your themes. We all know how important we are. Actually, we are our first cohort for diversity student group will graduate in May, and we are working on welcoming for second cohort in August. So I think this theme for next year will fit well with our coming class.
Thank you. Let me mention a couple things about academic libraries. First of all, just so you know, for the advocacy group, I have a steering committee of 5 people. So I have 2 co-chairs, 2 ALA people, and me. But I have what I'm calling a leadership group that has about 20 people. And we have sort of 5 working groups within the initiative. And each group, we're working very hard to make sure it has a public librarian, an academic librarian, and a school librarian, and also some diversity. We invited somebody from each of the, we wrote to each of the ethnic affiliates of ALA and asked them to give us somebody to work with us on this. So we're very much interested in making sure that as we come out with these tools and other things, that it connects with all different types of libraries. Special libraries, I think, are a little harder for us to do, although I still think there are a lot of the principles that will really apply. The ACRL, as you probably know, Association of College and Research Libraries, for those who aren't totally acronym familiar, division of ALA. ACRL just recently published something called The Value of Academic Libraries, and it is a e-publication that's available on the ACRL website, and it really is a review of what's out there. How are people collecting data and describing the value of libraries? And the value of doing something like that is, first of all, it gives other people ideas of something they might do that they haven't been doing already. But in addition, it sort of identifies where are the gaps, what are the things we should be looking at in order to find ways. And it's very clear for me, in working with the leadership of ACRL, that ACRL is very focused on this whole idea of how do we demonstrate value to our institutions. And so much of the work we will do on the initiative will be in collaboration with the different types of library divisions within ALA to make sure that we're paying attention. We're not duplicating, we're building on work that's already done there. We are using our sort of umbrella group to send people over to look at something that's on ACRL or something that is happening, some webinar that's happening, a way of sort of pulling all the advocacy things together. So I'm very interested in this. It's an area also that school librarians have become particularly interested in, because again, I think when you're part of an institution, whether you're a school library or an academic library, you can sort of see yourself as being sort of central to the mission. But it's getting other people to see that as well. And part of the way you do that is that you make those different kinds of connections. So school libraries have, somebody, when I was talking about this in my campaign, actually, it was like my campaign at Midwinter in 2010, I spoke to the AASL Affiliates Assembly, which is a large group of school librarians representing all over the country. And I was talking about this idea of becoming seen as essential. And I just talked about discretionary services and saying that school libraries, I think, the big challenge is to be seen as part of the instructional part of the institution, not what I call discretionary services. Well, a lovely school librarian who I didn't know sent me an email and said, in our world, and this may not be true everywhere, but this is somebody who was in Texas, in our world, we're referred to as ancillary services. And if it's an ancillary service, then it's in there with the cafeteria and the custodial services. So moving libraries, school library media centers into a category that is seen like the class. So when there's this a decision that we aren't going to cut classroom teachers, that's the school librarian as well as those people who are teaching history or biography or biology or whatever it is. That's the move that we need to make, and it really needs to happen, I think, in all different types of libraries. Academic libraries, you know, again, I've gotten to know very well in the public library world some elected officials, the people who've had oversight over the library. And I knew they really struggled when the money was short about how to fund the library, that it was really, they wanted to be able to do it. It wasn't that they thought it was a bad thing, but it became much easier for them when I could give them something that they could then say, it's a real priority of this elected body to invest in workforce development, and here's what the public library does. And so being able to make those kinds of ties was really important.
You know, this topic has been on my mind recently because one of the big buzzwords in education now is this idea of self-regulated learning. And I'm seeing it pop up in online learning, for example, where there is no teacher to guide the person. They have to regulate their own learning, monitor it, organize it, and so forth. And, you know, how come people are not looking at the libraries as the original self-regulated learning environment, and that people in the library can serve as coaches to help you learn something on your own. But I think that was the original purpose, I'm sure, hundreds of years ago, but somehow I guess that's been lost.
Making that connection to learning is one that public libraries struggle with a little bit more, I think, than school and academic do, simply because of the environment. They're in their formal educational environment. Obviously, they must be connected to learning. But you're absolutely right. It's one of the things that has been really important to libraries in their history. And if you look at, and I looked, frankly, one of the interesting things about the work we did around diversity in Multnomah County was we started, for instance, hiring staff that were bilingual, bicultural. And when we said bicultural, it didn't mean that you actually had to come from that culture, but it did mean you had to have lived in that culture for a period of time so that you understood the culture in a way that was very different from just having met somebody on the street. So when we started hiring people that were bilingual, bicultural, say for Russian English or Vietnamese English, people started coming into the library. And with a lot of immigrant communities, they don't have any kind of experience with what a public library is. So they have a really hard time sort of making that connection to begin with, that they should be coming to a library in order to learn or to become more comfortable in their new country, in their new environment. And we see that in the history of public libraries. I mean, I remember my history of libraries class in library school about the really important role that libraries played, particularly during the Depression and during the waves of immigrants when libraries were first opening in terms of assimilation and finding of their way in this new country in ways that were pretty powerful. That kind of goes up and down when, the biggest use spike we've seen in the use of libraries before this latest economic downturn was the Great Depression. I mean, so you sort of, these roles sort of pop up and then they kind of fade in the background. They don't go away, but we just don't hear them as much. But that self-regulated learning is a great concept because it really is a way, I think, that public libraries have been used a lot. And probably everyone sitting around this table has used the public library or, depending if you're connected to an educational institution, for self-regulated learning, something that you just needed to know and you were able to find it without somebody guiding you. And the idea of the coach, too, I think is a really powerful one because...
I'm struggling with that because, okay, if I'm writing a paper, I can go to the reference librarian, but that's really not the same as somebody who I can go to periodically and they can say, how are you doing on that thing? Maybe help me set some goals or benchmarks for myself. Come up with some learning strategies, things like that. And, it wouldn't take a lot to have a designated person like that who could really, and then all of a sudden the match between the classroom, the formal classroom learning, and the informal self-regulated learning is just a perfect complement.
The number of people, I saw this particularly when I worked in a branch library. It wasn't true when I worked in a large central library, but when I worked in a branch library, the lasting connections you felt with regular people who came in. I mean, I knew people who were working on getting licensing degrees and other things, and they might not have been using that much in the way of resources from our library, but they were often using the space, the quietness, the kinds of things that they might have lived in a place that they couldn't have any private space. So, and this was much more convenient to them than going to whatever educational institution they were going to, a vocational educational institution. So again, I think there's real opportunity to sort of identify that and find ways to talk about it that are much more powerful with people who are looking at what are we doing in our community and what can we live without. I mean, I think that's what even the politicians who I would admire are still, you know, they're struggling with reductions, and what does that mean, and how do we make those reductions, and where do we take that money from? And the more we're able to find the stories that really resonate and tell them in powerful ways, I think we position ourselves for the person who thinks education is the most important thing, person who thinks economic development and workforce development is the most important thing. What's, you know, what are the priorities? One of the things that I do with elected officials when I first get in a community is I go and say, I want to know what's important to you. What are your priorities? What do you care about most in this community that government is doing? Because I was really interested in how did I then go back to them and talk about what we were doing in a way that resonated with what they thought was important. Yeah?
Right, this is kind of molded a little bit in my head, but speaking of how libraries in the future could be reaching out to different communities, I'm from the mountains of Western North Carolina, and so is my family stretches up into Virginia. I'm a first generation high school graduate. My grandparents didn't even graduate elementary school. So there's a whole communities all across this country where we learn the foundations that these certain groups who just don't trust outsiders at all. Even myself, with a family member, I'm a little bit suspect in my family because I have higher education than. But the Library of Congress has been advocating reaching out to all different types of groups, particularly in preservation activities. But personally, in February, my grandfather died. And when I went back to visit my family, I found out they have all kinds of issues which they didn't even realize that a library or information can help them. For instance, as far as they wanted to have a slideshow at my grandpa's funeral, and my family had no idea what a slideshow was. And the funeral home was going to charge them $120. They had no idea. That was like $1, actually, the real value. And I was like, yeah, your library would probably helped you with this. And they just did not know about it. As far as legal issues goes, trying to track like properties and wills from my great-grandmother, the library could help them with that. And actually, I had to do the research because as far as transliteracy goes, a lot of people in my family are not actually literate. So just even knowing that they could go to the library and look up this resource would be extremely important for them. So, and of course, President Obama is pushing for broadband in these communities. I mean, you travel through some of these smaller western counties that have like little signs that say, we're an e-community. And I'm like, no, you're not. You don't have broadband. I mean, dial-up internet is hard to access these days. So it's kind of strange that's listed. So what I would like to see in the future for libraries is to be in these smaller communities where people don't trust us, let alone they've never even heard of AOA. They have no idea what that even means. Is to empower the librarians to go out into these smaller communities and work and need to get face-to-face and know the people and tell them about these resources. Because, I mean, yeah, they send their kids off to school and maybe my little cousin gets taken to the library by my grandmother to get on the internet, but that's too busy of an environment because there's people coming out of the library, so it's hard for her to learn. So yeah, I think it's just if we can move forward and also think about the smaller communities because they just don't have any clue about the resources that we can provide for them.
The challenge around rural libraries is, as I said earlier, I spent most of my career in DC, but I spent the last few years in Portland, Oregon. But one of the things that happened there was that the state library in Oregon is very, it does really good work, and it does really, some people wouldn't say that about their state libraries, I'll tell you. I learned this the hard way. I thought, oh, all state libraries are about this one, they aren't about the same. They do different things, but they're also have different positions within their states. But one of the things that I loved that Oregon did was some of the money, some of the federal grant money they get, they would give often to us in Multnomah County because we had a lot of resources that could support something. So we would develop a program about using books with young children that would be aimed at parents and caregivers to young children, but to people who were not used to reading to kids and just they didn't know there was any value. They really didn't know how to do it. And part of that grant was we developed it, and then we got a second year where we actually did video instructional things that we then could send to all the rural libraries that were throughout the state, and they were specific. And then our trainers, our staff, would go out and train a group of library workers who worked in a particular rural county where there were small libraries, not much in the way of resources, but they did have, they had computers. I think the real challenge, you talked about it a little bit there, is the staff time that people have. A lot of these are one-person libraries. And if they're out, then the library isn't open. So they have to make some choices about how much they're able to do that. But you're right, there's so much that people just don't have any idea. Most people, and it sounds like your family is this way, would think that the library is there for people who like to read and need to get some stuff to read. That's the sort of, so for them, if that's not part of what their life is, that's not what they're looking for. And they have the image of the library, but they haven't actually been in a library to see the different kinds of things that are done. But I think that's a real challenge just in general, is how do we push things out in such a way that it's not just there it is on the computer and available in technology, when we still have a large part of the population of this country who have very little experience and comfort with technology, if any. And so we make, this is one of the things that drives me crazy, is that, like all this federal government stuff now that you can only do online. There are hundreds of thousands of people in this country who not only, millions of people who don't have access to online, but also who, even if they came into the library, they wouldn't know what to do online. So we have, I think this is a real place, rural libraries have an opportunity to create that kind of resource for the community that serves it in the kinds of ways that you've identified. Things that libraries really do, but they don't advertise as much, but they have somebody who can help people with doing them. So thank you for sharing that. I think rural libraries are one of the areas that we tend to overlook. They don't, they're not in the news a lot. I had a wonderful experience in Idaho in October. I went to the Sawtooth Mountains. If you ever go to Idaho and you love the outdoors, go to the Sawtooth Mountains. They are as spectacular as the Canadian Rockies and much less crowded. And if you go in September or October, they're even less crowded than they're very popular in July and August, but once school starts, they get, you can get there and actually get campsites and other things. Anyway, I was going to be there when I needed to do some ALA business. So I thought, well, I'll look and see where there's a library, because most libraries offer Wi-Fi now, and so if you can find one, you can at least get some internet service. And I looked up, and the town of Stanley, which advertises that it has a population of 100 people, had a Stanley Community Library. So I wrote to the info, email address and said, do you have Wi-Fi access, and is it available, what are your hours, and because some of that stuff was, the summer information was on the website. I got a lovely email back from the librarian there, and she said, yes, we have Wi-Fi, and it's available 24/7, and we have a small library. And I said I might need to make a conference call and have Wi-Fi access, and would it be possible for me to find some space in the library where I could talk on the telephone and also, oh yes, come in, we'll take care of you. So I go to this library. It's obviously the center of this community. I mean, there's just people in all day. It's very clear that there are many people in that community that's where they get their internet access. That's where they do their email. That's where they do whatever it is they need to do on the internet. There was a full-time librarian, although she was very apologetic that she didn't have a library degree, but she had a master's degree in education, and I assured her that it was really quite all right. I didn't feel that you had to have a library degree in order to be able to do, I mean, I've worked with lots of people who have not had library degrees and have been wonderful at serving the public. And she obviously had learned a lot of stuff since she'd been asked to take on this job. She had one part-time person who sort of helped cover for her so that they could go out and do some stuff. The range of programs that library had was phenomenal. It was open every day of the week, not 8, 12 hours, but at least 4 hours a day, even in the wintertime. The librarian there, her great plan was that as soon as the economy got better, she was going to push to build a new library, because they were in a house that wasn't ADA compliant in any way, shape, or form. I mean, you could get in the front door and the computers were there, so somebody could be served, but you know, some of the stuff was up a very steep staircase and there was no elevator, and I mean, it was an old house. And I said to her, how did you get this library? How do you get funding for this library? You know, I'm reading about libraries closing and budgets being cut all over. And she said, well, this community about 10 years ago voted to create a library district. So they have their self-taxing authority to create a library district. I'm sure it's not a ton of money. She goes after every grant that she can. She gets, there's one foundation apparently that sends new good books to libraries. She gets to pick out what they are. They told her she's the only one who's applied for them every year they've had them. She's gotten them every year. When I see somebody like that working in a rural library, I think to myself, wow, this profession is so lucky to have the kind of dedication that it has and the commitment. It was, for her, it was all about serving that community. She confessed in truth that there were about 200 people who lived in the valley who were also contributing money, but because they created this library district, and this is a real high tourist area, so I think they collect a lot of tax dollars that are related to tourism, but they also get some money from the state. So, you know, they get a pot of money that's enough to sort of, but I thought how wonderful to have these dreams of what she really wanted to create in that community. This is the kind of place, this is the place where occasionally in December, January, and February, the lowest temperature in the United States is in Stanley, Idaho. But it's so gorgeous. You know, she said, I said something about it to her in an email in like December or January, and she said, well, I got up this morning and it was -20. But she said, but it's absolutely gorgeous. And you can imagine, I mean, it's these ragged mountain peaks with snow all over them and lakes and clear blue sky and sort of big valleys, so you get these long vistas, and I just sort of visualized what it was like. But it is an example, I think, of the kind of thing that's happening in rural libraries with tremendously dedicated people working in them, often who have not had professional library training, but have become very good at the work that they do and have really strong, deep connections in the community in ways that are really powerful for their doing their jobs. Yeah.
I would just like to share some things that are going on in school media, and I'm very excited about the word advocacy. As we look at the phrase doing more with less, as we look at school media, we oftentimes see, as you said, media people are like at the forefront of what do you do every day, what are your outcomes? But we really don't look at the outcomes, we look at more or less the statistical information. We fill out what we call an AMTR report at the end of the year, which is an annual media technology report, and it reveals how many books did you circulate during the year, you know, how many people were actually in the library. But as you look at school media specialists, the role has changed completely. We now serve as maybe the technology specialist at the school, as well as the media specialist. We oftentimes, we do more with less because we absolutely have no funding, depending on what LEA you're located in. And I would just like to share this story. This is my first year here in Guilford County. Our family relocated here from Charlotte due to my husband's job. And so this has been a very interesting year for me. In Charlotte, which is a predominantly urban school district, we have media centers that are funded at the district level. Here in Greensboro, they're really funded, or Guilford County, at the school level. So I was asked to come speak to some principals, which was very interesting because in Charlotte, I served as an assistant principal of instruction. And so my goal for this presentation was to share, how media specialists can improve their circulation numbers. Well, when given the task, I thought, I can't really see where I can stand in front of anyone and compare school A to B. It's almost like comparing apples and oranges. How can I tell you to improve your search or your circulation statistics when at school A, I may be a high school media specialist. I may be running the media center and 2 technology labs. So my circulation statistics may not be high versus circulating books, but it could be very high as far as number of students or classes using the lab. So when you look at school B, which could be an elementary school in a predominantly low-income area, which oftentimes has a diverse population of students from different backgrounds that may have been pre-exposed, but usually not pre-exposed to a library. That media center sometimes is that first interaction as far as, the media center. So my circulation statistics may be very high because maybe I'm that media specialist that's saying to those parents, come, use the library, check out books for your students. I want to encourage them to use the media center. And I may be at Library C, the school where, people just don't use the media center. Maybe, my students and staff are more tech savvy. They have smartphones where they can download any book that I purchase. So, given that task, versus me sharing how to improve statistics, I more or less shared, as a principal or as an assistant principal or as a district person, how do I look at the media centers within the school district? Where are we at today and where do we need to go? So as you say, circulation and outcome, it would be lovely to see the outcomes looked at closer than just statistical numbers or closer than that AMTR report, because that report is just a small snapshot of what media specialists do or the tasks they perform on a daily basis. And as we look at media specialists, especially school media specialists, we see people retiring due to many different reasons. And we see new people coming in. Back 14 years ago when I worked in Durham as a media specialist, we received money, X amount per dollar per student, and it was great. And here you may receive 0 funding to $5,000 or $6,000 or maybe $12,000 per year, depending on the principal or the administrative staff you may have at your school. So as we look at media specialists, how do we encourage new people that are very tech savvy coming into this field? How do we encourage them to become a part of a school or a community when we don't have the funding to support, these programs, these schools? So I really urge, if we can do anything as far as being an advocacy versus media specialists, I tell them all the time, whatever you do every day, write it down, keep a log. But versus that log being your, this is my Bible, this is what I do every day, is there any way we can just, it would be lovely to see that AMTR report changed, where we just, not write down the statistical numbers, but what do we do? What do we bring to the school, this community? Are we offering those literacy services? Are we teaching literacy? I see many media specialists here in Guilford County. I think there's 120 schools. As I go out and visit, I see many different programs. I see some media specialists with literacy circles. I see some teaching literacy. I see some running labs. And I see some that really need to improve. But how do you do that if we don't have that guiding principle, we don't have that foundation, we don't have that support? And I think at the forefront of all of it, we look at it as, my job. Will I have this job next year? How important, is this program? What is the value added as far as having that media specialist? And I just see media specialists not as just someone who's sitting behind books. That role has changed completely. And if there was any way we could change that report, it would be great.
Well, I can't change the report, but I will tell you that I think that idea that you were talking about different schools need to do different things to serve the students depending on what the larger community is that they're serving. I saw that. I had an opportunity to visit some school libraries in New York City, and the first one we went to was in a high school building that was now 5 campuses. So it was 5 different sort of smaller schools, and each one of those smaller high schools had a principal. And this media specialist who was there was full of ideas and enthusiasm and had almost no money or space. And she was quite amazing. First of all, she had 5 bosses because she served all 5 schools, but there wasn't anybody who was really in charge. So she'd really been able to make good connections with like 3 out of the 5. She was still working on the other 2, but she was really working hard to get the 3 to notice the kinds of things that she was doing in the school. Where I think the particular area, the particular focus where I'm talking about are users talking for us, I think that there's real opportunity in the school library world for that to happen. You know, we saw the famous case of the Spokane moms in Washington State where 3 moms decided that closing school library was a really bad thing, that it would make a huge difference in the education. Well, the interesting thing about that was they not only fought that for where their kids were, but they realized school libraries were really important, so they actually went to the state level and worked at the state level to get something put into the state law about media centers and support for school library media centers because they thought they were so important. So the power that you and your colleagues have is to turn to the students, the parents, and the teachers. Again, I saw in one of these school libraries in New York, this teacher brought in his class, and then the librarian was doing some kind of media instruction thing in the class, but he loved the work that she did because it was really making kids explore research resources in ways that if left alone they wouldn't. They weren't allowed to use Wikipedia. You know, there were certain kinds of things that forced them to get into other resources. They had to use some print resources, but they could use some online resources. And that school librarian was working very hard with that teacher to get that teacher to be a real advocate for the school media program. Same thing I think can happen in colleges and universities where the students and the faculty are the ones who talk about the importance of the library as not just being central to education, but how it really made a difference in the work of their students or in the work themselves, what they were doing. So I think you've got a lot of great ideas. I wish I could help you with that one report. I know the statistical reports take on a life of their own and they become rather meaningless to most people. One of the people who's my co-chair for the overall advocacy initiative is a woman named Barbara Stripling, who's head of school libraries in New York, but she actually was head of school libraries in Arkansas before she went to New York. And she, don't quote me outside of this room, but she is obviously just totally frustrated by all the focus on data gathering and numbers, and not what are the kids really learning, what skills are they really, how information literate are they really becoming when they go through school, versus did they have this many numbers, whether it's, how many books did you circulate. You'd think people would move away from that now, given that libraries have so much more. I mean, public libraries had to start figuring out how to count things differently because the book stuff's changed and changed a long time ago. So, it's now, how many uses of the website, and, a variety of different kinds of things like that, and the resources, the databases that they subscribe to, and that sort of thing. So thank you for sharing that. It gives me a picture of sort of what the environment is for school media specialists here.
I'm going to have Lee's comment, but I'm going to make that the last comment because
Oh, I did the last word?
Yeah. Well, after, you know.
I'd just like to add one.
Molly's
piece to
response.
This, and, Bill was talking about earlier, Bill will do his idea of the library at the University of People, something that's very major, at least up to the Second World War. And what Pete Garrison was talking about, the apostles of culture, there was a point where librarians really were missionaries of the book out there. And I think we've lost to a great extent. But one of the things that has struck me about the conversation is it's focused on the library as an institution. And one of the issues that I've had, really, we're very involved with recruitment for the profession, particularly minority recruitment. And I've been to a number of places, historically, Black colleges, university, career days, and things like this, trying to talk to students about coming to our program. And there are two issues there. One is recruitment for the profession. One of the big issues to me is that people in general have no idea really what librarians do. And librarians can do this without really a structure around it. But our issue here is very local. We can recruit for our school. But to recruit for our program, we have to recruit for the profession in general prior to that. So there's a two-part piece to this thing that I think ALA probably could make a significant contribution to, just in generally what librarians do and why this is a good thing to do. It would be a major contribution to a great many of the issues that we're dealing with here.
I totally agree with you. I think this is something that our profession has felt for a long time. I mean, I'm, as I said, an accidental librarian who went to Simmons. Went to Simmons just because I was in this community that had a lot of highly educated people who were looking for jobs who had liberal arts degrees. Exactly. So I figured I needed some professional tool to get me a job.
Across the board, most of us are accidental.
Yeah.
The average age of students across the board in the U.S. and the library school program is about 35 or 40, which means that they didn't decide to do this when they were 8 years old.
Right.
There's a process in there that we really do need to look at.
Yeah, I think this is an area ALA is very interested in, has done some work in, but clearly what librarians do today versus what the vision of what librarians do.
Even things like the public library, public service announcement you talked about earlier, which is a beautiful piece. Doing something like this and why being a librarian is a great thing to do. Generally, recruitment for the profession will strengthen the profession in general, I think, in the public's eye, which is a major step in trying to strengthen the role of the public library and the perception of public libraries and academic libraries and school libraries and the information professions in general.
There is a video that I've seen that I thought was really quite powerful. It was, and I'm going to see if I can find it, and I'll send it to Clara, and she can shoot it out to people. That was focused on like 4 or 5 what I would call non-stereotypical looking librarians who talked about what they did and why this career was, but they were all fairly young. It was intended to be a recruitment tool. And it took people who came from very different interests and backgrounds and sort of showed how libraries were the right place for them, because what they were interested in was doing X, Y, or Z, and they could see that a library degree was what they needed in order to be able to work in the kind of environment they wanted to work in. So I think, again, I think there's opportunity here, but I want to just, if I can find this, send it to you so you can have a chance to see it.
Yeah, that would be useful, trying to get that out to people. Though, maybe I'm looking at the 30-second elevator speech on it. But a variety of different kinds of efforts in order to promote the profession as opposed to the library itself, what a librarian can do and why and how.
number of things like this, because recruitment for profession really is one of our hurdles we haven't really
Right.
quite gotten over.
Right. Well, one of the things that I think it was the students at Kent State said was talking about the salaries for, and I think I'd started early on saying, no one chooses this profession to get rich. There are some people who have become librarians who've gotten rich. Mostly they've started some kind of technology
But
thing.
at the same time, you've got an undergraduate degree in English.
Yes.
The options are.
In my case, if you had an undergraduate degree in psychology, it was the same thing. You know, what can I do? I can't be a clinical psychologist. It was very clear that there are many undergraduate degrees that didn't exactly propel you into a really interesting job. And part of it also is people are looking for interesting work. And college graduates are finding that there's not a whole lot of interesting work out there with a college degree. I mean, I don't know the exact number, but I know the number of people who have college degrees now is the percentage that had high school degrees like in the early 50s. And when you look at that, that means college people with college degrees are generally going to be getting the jobs that people with high school degrees were getting. And that's, it's not that there are no interesting jobs, but if you want to use your education in some way, and you want to be intellectually engaged in your work and not just take home a paycheck.
Exactly. That's the kind of thing we need to get across.
Yeah.
That this is really the recruitment point right there, I think.
Yeah.
Well, one of the one of the presentations I went to about a year ago was on why there is a lack of African American males in the profession, and the presenter was indicating that actually in the American Library Association webpage, there isn't a definition of what a library is or what a librarian does. I'm wondering if that might be a good place to start.
Yeah, but people, you're not going to get the general public to look at the ALA webpage.
Right.
A lot of it's getting that message out in some kind of a tangible form to an audience that in general is reasonably well educated, informed. I'm just not even sure about the forms to do this in.
Well, I think the Old
Very
Spice,
precise.
the Old Spice guy actually helped, don't
Yes.
he?
Yeah, there are things that, I remember when I was in library school, we did a volunteer project in a community organization that was in Roxbury. And they had all these books that had been donated. And so a group of us from Simmons, like 4 or 5 of us, went over to kind of, we organized the materials in sort of human interest categories and then did a kind of very rough catalog for them. And it was kind of a fun project to work at. And I remember the person who ran the nonprofit said to us, "You don't look like librarians." So I really try when I'm at conferences now, ALA conferences, to figure out what that look is. And then when you actually live in cities that have conventions like ALA, and I was very near the convention center in DC, and I went by it in Portland a lot. So you see people coming to something at the convention center. It's really interesting to sort of try to guess, what do those people do for a living? And then go and look it up and see what's actually at the convention center. It is pretty easy to tell when there's some kind of academic conference. It's pretty easy to tell when there's some kind of business conference. It's pretty easy to tell when there's some kind of lawyer, but not trial lawyer. It's more the lobbyist kind of lawyer. Just by the way people are dressed, what they're carrying in their hands, how sort of coiffed they are, those kinds of things. So I'm still kind of looking for them. And my husband will say sometimes when we're in a city where there's an ALA conference, "Oh, you can sure tell this is a librarian's conference." And so I want to look at the people he's looking at so I can see what is that image that he has.
The real eye-opener for me, it was Philadelphia a number of years back, the Summer of Philadelphia conference, and just as ALA was winding down, the National Association of Church Organists coming in. And they also had the same hotels pretty much, but they also had a different set of buses. They had the Gala buses where the organist people were using, and the lines were you can really tell the difference between the two lines. In general, I would assume that it would be part of the same population group, but it obviously wasn't.
I'm going to break in here now because we're about to lose the battery on this computer. So I want to say goodbye to everybody on the virtual world and to thank Molly very much before they go. And to present you with a gift from us that